Dorothy Langston, a 75-year-old African-American woman, stepped onto her flight from Wellington to Sierra City expecting a peaceful, first-class experience. Instead, she was greeted by a cold stare from flight attendant Whitney Barnes, who muttered under her breath, "You're not supposed to be here," and quickly redirected her to the back of the plane. Dorothy, ever composed, assumed it was a misunderstanding and followed orders without protest. But when the plane landed and Whitney's smug grin vanished upon seeing Dorothy's son, Marcus Langston, the CEO of the very airline she worked for, it became clear this was no simple mix-up. What began as an ordinary flight had spiraled into a disturbing confrontation with racism, and Whitney had no idea who she was really messing with. Dorothy had boarded at Wellington Regional Airport with the quiet grace of a woman who'd spent decades fighting for justice. At 75, her poise was undeniable. Elegant silver hair tied back into a neat bun, a finely pressed navy blue suit fitting her frame with dignified precision. She had booked this first-class ticket months in advance, a rare luxury after years as a civil rights attorney, and she looked forward to the serenity of tea at cruising altitude. Her polished shoes tapped lightly on the metal jet bridge as she approached the aircraft, boarding pass in one hand, her worn leather handbag in the other. She'd taken this route before, knew the rhythm of boarding well, and expected nothing more than the usual polite nod from the flight crew. But today, something felt off. The moment Dorothy made eye contact with Whitney Barnes, she felt it. Whitney stood tall and stiff at the cabin door, her blonde ponytail taut, her uniform crisp and spotless, and a shiny name tag perched right over her heart. Probably in her mid-30s, Whitney's icy blue eyes scanned Dorothy from head to toe, lingering on her dark complexion, her age, the expensive cut of her clothing. Dorothy extended her boarding pass with a warm, practiced smile, the kind honed through decades of being the only one like her in boardrooms and courtrooms. Whitney accepted the pass, her fingers brushing against it with deliberate slowness. Her lips twitched, half smirk, half sneer. She stared at the screen, then back at Dorothy. "There's a problem," Whitney said, her tone clipped and mechanical, barely concealing the cold edge beneath. "This seat isn't available. We're dealing with an overbooked situation." Dorothy's smile faltered. "I booked this ticket months ago," she replied, her voice calm but assertive, her courtroom presence slipping back into place. "First class, seat 2A. I even confirmed this morning." But Whitney didn't even glance at her tablet. She didn't check anything, not the manifest, not the curtain behind her that led to a half-empty first-class cabin. "Doesn't matter," she said sharply. "Things change. You're in economy now. Follow me." She pivoted on her heel and strode down the aisle, ponytail swaying like a whip. Dorothy stood frozen for a second, her pulse racing. She knew this feeling all too well, the subtle sting of being told you didn't belong. But this wasn't subtle. It was blatant, public, designed to humiliate. She glanced around. A few passengers behind her raised their brows, others looked away. Not one person said a word. Taking a breath, she followed. Her heels echoed quietly as she stepped into the plane's narrow body, past the plush wide seats of first class, and into the cramped rows of economy. The air smelled like reheated coffee and recycled air. Whitney marched her all the way to row 28, pointing to a middle seat wedged between a drowsy teenager and a young mother juggling a restless toddler. "Here," Whitney said flatly. Her gaze dared Dorothy to argue. Dorothy looked at the seat, then at Whitney. Her jaw tightened. "This isn't right," she said, keeping her tone even. "I paid for first class. I saw open seats up front." Whitney's smirk returned, thin and mocking. "They're reserved," she snapped. "Sit here, or I'll have you removed from the flight." The threat clung in the air like smog. Dorothy knew better than to escalate. She'd been thrown out of fancier places than this. She needed to get to Sierra City. So she sat, folding herself into the narrow space, her knees brushing the tray table, her purse clutched tightly in her lap. The teenager next to her dozed off, his elbow jabbing her side. The toddler wailed. Dorothy inhaled deeply, her face composed, her breathing steady. Around her, the whispers started. "Can you believe she thought she could stay up there?" A man 2 rows back muttered. "They'll sell those seats to anyone now," a woman replied, her tone dripping with contempt. Dorothy didn't flinch, but her fingers gripped her purse harder. Her nails dug into the leather. She'd been through worse. And Whitney Barnes? She had no idea what storm she'd just summoned. The remark stung, sharp and condescending. Dorothy didn't turn, didn't blink, but her fingers gripped the strap of her purse like a lifeline, her nails digging into the worn leather. A few rows away, Whitney Barnes adjusted an overhead bin, her smug smile firmly in place. She thought she'd won, thought she'd put Dorothy back in her place, thought that would be the end of it. Dorothy let her believe that, let her bask in the illusion of triumph, because Dorothy Langston hadn't spent 75 years carving space in rooms that tried to erase her just to fold now. She'd been turning slights into strategy her whole life, and this was no different. As the engines roared to life beneath her, Dorothy slid her hand into her purse with deliberate care. Her thumb hovered over her phone screen, her eyes calm but focused. She scrolled to a name glowing in her contacts like a beacon: Marcus Langston, her son, the one person Whitney Barnes never expected. She typed quickly, every word a sharpened blade. "Flight attendant pushed me to economy. First class empty. Name? Whitney Barnes. Fix it." She hit send, the message disappearing into the digital ether just as the plane began its slow taxi to the runway. Up ahead, Whitney glanced back over her shoulder and caught a glimpse of Dorothy on her phone. For a split second, her smile wavered. Then it returned, harder, dismissive. She thought it was nothing, a futile gesture from a tired, invisible woman. She had no idea what she had just ignited. The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft lifted into the sky, the hum of ascent humming through plastic armrests and tired seat cushions. Dorothy sat motionless, her pressed jacket rumpled against the worn seat. On the outside, she was still. Inside, her mind raced. She'd been through worse, faced off against arrogant judges, biased juries, whispered slurs from polished lips. But this was personal, so small, so quiet, and yet it cut deeper. A seat she'd earned, bought with her own money, taken away without reason, unless the shade of her skin and the assumptions attached to it somehow were reason enough. She closed her eyes, let the toddler's high-pitched wails beside her fade into background noise. In her mind, she pictured Marcus's face. 38 floors above downtown Sierra City, he'd be reading her message. Jaw tight, eyes blazing. He'd act fast. She knew it. But this wasn't over yet. Not even close. Whitney's footsteps clicked briskly through the aisle, her posture dripping with authority. She stopped near Dorothy's row, pretending to adjust a seatbelt, her eyes flicking toward Dorothy with quiet satisfaction. "Enjoying the ride?" she asked sweetly, her voice pitched high, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Dorothy didn't answer, didn't even blink. She met Whitney's eyes with the same cool, unwavering calm she used in front of juries. The smirk on Whitney's face twitched, just barely. Then she turned on her heel, sauntering back toward first class. Her laughter trailed behind her like a ribbon of spite. Dorothy watched her go, Her heart stayed steady, her resolve sharper than ever. Whitney thought this was a moment of petty control, a quick ego stroke, a game she'd already won. She had no idea Dorothy Langston had played tougher games, and always outlasted. The plane leveled off. The seatbelt sign blinked off. Dorothy shifted slightly, her phone resting in her lap like a loaded weapon. The first move had been made. Whitney didn't even realize she was in the middle of a fight. Dorothy sat still, wedged between the chaos of coach class. A snoring teen slumped on her shoulder, a toddler flailing and dripping juice beside her. Her slacks were damp from a spill, her blouse wrinkled. But her mind? Razor sharp. At 35,000 feet, the hum of the plane couldn't drown her focus. She gripped her phone again and dialed. It rang twice before Marcus's voice crackled through, taut with concern. "Mom? You okay? I got your message. What's going on with this Whitney Barnes?" Dorothy kept her tone low, her words honed like courtroom testimony. "She said first class was overbooked," she whispered. "But there were seats. I saw them. She forced me back here without even checking. I've seen this before, Marcus. Same smile, same tone." There was a pause. Then Marcus's voice sharpened. "I'm pulling the manifest now. Stay put. I'll take care of it." Dorothy nodded, trusting her son's word. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her purse just as the cabin lights flickered overhead. In first class, Whitney Barnes glided down the aisle like a hostess in a champagne dream. Her tray balanced 3 crystal flutes, each filled with golden bubbles. She handed one to a man in a tailored pinstripe suit, her tone syrupy. "Enjoy your flight, sir. Can I get you anything else?" He grinned, raising the glass in thanks, completely unaware of the storm stirring behind the curtain. Whitney's eyes flicked toward the economy cabin every few minutes. Her smirk deepened each time. She thought Dorothy was buried, out of sight, out of mind. But Dorothy wasn't waiting quietly. As Whitney passed by again, Dorothy raised a hand. Her voice was polite, but firm. "Excuse me, miss? May I have a glass of water?" Whitney stopped abruptly. Her heels clacked against the vinyl flooring. She tilted her head like the request insulted her personally. "Water?" she repeated, her voice dripping mockery. "We're serving up here right now. You'll have to wait." Whitney Barnes turned away, her ponytail snapping over her shoulder as she marched off, leaving Dorothy Langston sitting in stale silence, surrounded by sidelong glances. The rejection wasn't subtle, and it wasn't missed. A few rows ahead, a white man in a wrinkled polo shirt twisted around, his brows furrowed. "She's been sitting there forever." "Just give her a damn drink," he muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Whitney froze mid-step. Her forced smile stiffened, then cracked. She spun back around toward Dorothy, her blue eyes narrowed like knives. "Fine," she snapped. She grabbed a flimsy plastic cup from the service cart, poured lukewarm water from a scratched pitcher, and shoved it toward Dorothy. The liquid sloshed over the rim, splattering across her lap. "There. Happy now?" Dorothy took the cup, her grip calm, her expression unreadable. A practiced mask. "Thank you," she replied, her tone smooth as silk, denying Whitney the flare-up she clearly craved. But Whitney wasn't finished. She leaned down, her breath hot against Dorothy's cheek. "You're lucky I even bothered," she whispered, her voice like poison in the ear. Then she straightened her collar, adjusted her cuffs, and strutted back to first class, her laughter trailing behind like a sneer. The man in the polo shirt wasn't the only one watching now. Across the aisle, a young black woman with braided hair shifted uncomfortably. Her hand hovered near her phone, debating whether to press record. Dorothy met her gaze and gave a subtle nod, a silent thank you for the flicker of solidarity. She sipped the warm water, her thoughts racing. Marcus was working behind the scenes, but she couldn't sit quietly and absorb Whitney's venom much longer. When Whitney passed by again, Dorothy raised her voice, not loud, but clear enough to cut through the hum of the cabin. "I understand that first class gets priority," she said, "but economy passengers deserve basic service too. I've been waiting over an hour. What's the holdup?" Whitney stopped cold. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. The tone wasn't hostile, but it carried weight. Passengers turned to look. Whispers stirred like wind through dry leaves. For a heartbeat, Whitney looked cornered, her authority fraying. "You're right," she said finally, her voice strained, her smile forced and brittle. "I'll get you something. Sit tight." She turned on her heel, her heels hammering the floor with clipped frustration, a minor retreat, but a satisfying one. Dorothy leaned back into her cramped seat, her pulse settling. The faintest smile tugged at the corner of her lips. She'd stared down worse than Whitney Barnes, judges who dismissed her with smirks, officers who doubted her worth, but she'd outlasted them all. This was just another round. And this time, she'd landed the first punch. The young woman with braids across the aisle offered a small thumbs up, a quiet alliance forming in the stuffy cabin air. For a moment, Dorothy believed she'd bought herself some breathing room, a shift in momentum. She was wrong. Whitney returned minutes later, a tray loaded with coffee cups for the row just ahead. Her steps deliberate. Her eyes locked on Dorothy with pinpoint focus. As she passed, her elbow jerked, suddenly, suspiciously. The tray tilted. A flood of scalding coffee spilled from the cups, cascading down onto Dorothy's lap. The heat tore through her slacks, burning her thighs. She gasped in pain, jolting upright. A cup clattered to the floor with a sharp plastic thunk. Passengers gasped. The teen beside her snapped awake. The mother beside her pulled her toddler into a tight grip. The young woman with braids shot to her feet. "What the hell was that?" she yelled. Whitney spun around, her hands flying to her chest in faux shock. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Total accident, I swear." Her voice pitched high and breathless, all theatrics. But her eyes, they flickered with something else, something almost gleeful. Dorothy gritted her teeth, the burn searing into her skin. She didn't scream, didn't give Whitney the satisfaction. She dabbed at her soaked lap with napkins from her purse, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Her tailored suit ruined. "An accident," she repeated, her voice low and razor-sharp. "Funny how that keeps happening to me." Whitney's grin twitched. She shrugged, tone flipping casual. "Clumsy me. I'll grab you a towel." She turned, sauntering back down the aisle with a swing in her hips, her indifference like a slap in the face. The cabin buzzed now. Passengers leaned into each other, whispering. "Did you see that?" someone said. She didn't even stumble. "That was no accident," the young woman with braids muttered, her voice tight with fury. Dorothy sat frozen, drenched in coffee, her skin burning. Her mind raced. She had called Whitney out earlier, thought she'd won a small victory. But this wasn't a slight. It was an assault, a public humiliation. Her purse buzzed. Marcus's name lit up the screen. But she didn't answer. Not yet. Not until she had a plan. Whitney thought this was checkmate. She was wrong. Dorothy's pain didn't weaken her. It sharpened her. This battle wasn't over. Not even close. So what's Whitney Barnes planning next after that scalding little stunt? Will she retreat now that Dorothy Langston has pushed back? Or is she gearing up for something even nastier? Can Dorothy flip the script in front of a whole plane full of watching eyes? Buckle up, because the turbulence is just getting started. Dorothy sat stiffly in her cramped economy seat, the fabric of her slacks still clinging damp to her thighs, the burn from the hot coffee pulsing beneath her skin. The cabin buzzed with a steady drone as the plane cruised 35,000 feet above the ground, but the air around her was tight with tension. Nearby, passengers glanced over, some offering fleeting looks of pity, others curiosity. The young woman with braids across the aisle still held her phone close, her jaw clenched in silent outrage. Dorothy's hands trembled slightly as she dabbed her lap with a crumpled napkin, but her face remained stone. Her eyes stayed locked on the back of the seat in front of her. She'd endured Whitney's cruelty, felt the heat of that humiliation. But this moment wasn't about pain anymore. Now she needed something bigger than words. She needed leverage. With quiet resolve, Dorothy raised her hand again, her voice slicing through the cabin like a blade. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor." Whitney, still hovering near the curtain separating first class from coach, froze mid-step. The tray of empty coffee cups in her hands rattled slightly. She turned slowly, her ponytail flicking behind her, her narrowed gaze sharp and cold. But the damage was done. Dorothy's words echoed with power, amplified by the dozen passengers now watching. She couldn't ignore it. Not now. Not with Dorothy's lap still soaked, not with the murmurs already spreading like wildfire. "Fine," Whitney spat, her voice taut, slicing through the air. She turned and disappeared behind the curtain, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Minutes passed, thick and heavy. The engines hummed in the silence. Dorothy sat tall, her silver hair catching the overhead lights, her hands folded tightly over her purse. She'd stared down worse, judges who ruled with prejudice, police officers who pulled her over just because. She wouldn't shrink now. Not for Whitney, not for anyone. Then the curtain parted. A new figure emerged, a man in his late 30s with a badge on his chest reading Cal, the lead attendant. His brown hair was slicked back, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his jaw twitching with nerves. He looked around like a man thrown into a storm he didn't understand. Crouching beside Dorothy's seat, he lowered his voice. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry. There's been a misunderstanding. We've got a seat available for you up front. Please, come with me." Dorothy's eyes narrowed, scanning him. His apology was genuine, but it wasn't coming from him. She could see it. This was Whitney cracking. Dorothy nodded once. She rose with a poise that belied the aching pain in her legs and the sting on her skin. She smoothed her rumpled blazer, lifted her chin, and walked the aisle. As she passed, the woman with braids whispered, "You got this." A flicker of warmth lit in Dorothy's chest. Whitney stood stiffly near the entrance to first class, her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She didn't speak, didn't even move. Dorothy didn't break her stride. The plush seats stretched out before her like a different world, spacious, clean, and untouched by the chaos behind her. Cal gestured toward seat 2A, the very one she'd booked. He offered a napkin and a timid smile. "Anything you need, just let me know. I'll take care of it." Dorothy nodded as she eased into the wide leather seat. Her purse rested on her lap. The cushion was cool against her thighs. A steaming cup of coffee was placed gently on her tray. This one didn't spill. She took a sip, the warmth grounding her. For a moment, it felt like she'd won, like she'd taken back what was stolen. She was wrong. Whitney lingered a few feet away, her posture rigid, her elbow tapping against her opposite arm. She stared at Dorothy, not with defeat, but with something simmering beneath the surface. A storm was brewing in her silence. Then the plane lurched violently, rattling the overhead compartments. Cups trembled, passengers gasped. The lights flickered above like warning signs. Dorothy gripped the armrests, her coffee sloshing in its cup. Whitney seized the moment like a wolf. "See?" she called out loudly. "This is what happens when passengers don't follow the rules." She stormed into the galley, heels striking the floor like thunder. Seconds later, the captain's voice cut through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've hit a patch of unexpected turbulence. There have also been reports of disruptive behavior in the cabin contributing to the issue. We ask that everyone remain seated and calm." The words hit like a slap. Passengers twisted in their seats, eyes turned toward Dorothy. In first class, a woman in a silk scarf leaned toward her husband. "Is it her?" she whispered. He nodded slowly, his brow creased. A man 2 seats up muttered, "Figures." Dorothy's stomach sank. The seat had changed. The setting had changed. But the game was the same. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, hadn't caused anything. But Whitney had twisted a bump in the air into a weapon, subtle, precise, and venomous. The plane steadied, the turbulence easing into a dull sway. Whitney emerged from the galley, her expression smug, her steps slow. As she passed Dorothy's seat, she leaned in just enough, her voice a venom-laced whisper. "You don't belong here. Never will." She straightened again, her uniform immaculate, her mask of professionalism refastened, and continued down the aisle, leaving behind a chilling silence. Dorothy sat still. Her victory had turned to ash. But the fire in her chest? That was just beginning to rise again. Whitney Barnes straightened her jacket, smoothed her ponytail, and strode confidently down the aisle, leaving Dorothy Langston sitting alone in a sea of stares that no longer felt curious but suspicious. The cabin settled into an eerie hush, the low thrum of the engines becoming the only steady sound as whispers rippled through first class like an invisible current. Dorothy stayed motionless, the cup of coffee cooling in her hands, untouched. She had spoken up, demanded a supervisor, reclaimed her seat. But for what? This didn't feel like justice. It felt like a trap sprung too late, a hollow win poisoned by Whitney's theatrics. The glare of the other passengers bore into her, fueled now by the captain's vague but loaded announcement. She could feel their assumptions wrapping around her like chains. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It was about Whitney's need to erase her, to punish her for daring to belong. Her purse buzzed faintly, Marcus's name blinking on the screen. Dorothy didn't answer. Not yet. She needed to think, to strategize, because Whitney wasn't backing down, not by a long shot. The air in first class had changed. It was thick now, dense with tension. The scent of champagne, leather, and suspicion wafted through the cabin like smoke before a fire. Dorothy looked around. The businessman in the pinstripe suit from earlier was staring at her over his flute of champagne, his brow slightly furrowed. Unspoken judgment lingered in his gaze. 2 rows ahead, the woman with the silk scarf leaned into her husband, whispering something Dorothy couldn't hear, but she could feel the slice of it in her chest. Dorothy kept her hands still, her posture straight, her face unreadable. She wouldn't let them see her flinch. She'd forced Whitney's hand, but the victory had no sweetness. Only the bitter aftertaste of lies left to fester. Somewhere between the clouds and the truth, Whitney had turned a simple seat dispute into a public accusation. And the crew? They were buying it. The friendly attendant, Cal, who had escorted her back to her rightful seat, now shuffled past with his clipboard. He didn't meet Dorothy's gaze. The warmth from earlier gone, replaced by a nervous distance. She was alone again, surrounded by comfort she'd earned, but imprisoned by the false narrative Whitney had sown. Dorothy set her coffee down on the tray table, the surface rattling slightly. She reached up, brushing the pearls at her throat. a calming habit born of years arguing in courts where no one wanted her voice. She'd thought summoning Cal would turn the tide. Instead, it had only sharpened Whitney's resolve. The turbulence had been a fluke, a moment of nature, but Whitney had wielded it like a weapon, twisting it into a new narrative, that Dorothy was the cause, the disruption, the threat. And thanks to the captain's vague announcement, Whitney's lie now carried authority. Dorothy's chest ached, not from fear, but from a rage too old and too familiar. She'd seen this playbook before, the way a lie could stain faster than the truth could catch up. The plane cruised smoothly now, the earlier jolt fading into memory, but the air felt no lighter. Dorothy remained stiff, her damp clothes clinging to her skin, the ache in her legs pulsing faintly with each breath. She refused to look weak, but she knew, deep in her bones, that Whitney wasn't done. From the front of the cabin, Whitney floated between passengers with the grace of someone used to control. Her blonde ponytail swung with every step, her pristine uniform gleaming like nothing had ever cracked her world. She smiled warmly at a man in row 4, her voice lilting, casual, perfect. But every few seconds, her eyes drifted back toward Dorothy, a flicker of something darker pulsing beneath her facade. Predator's patience. Dorothy caught the end of a hushed conversation as Whitney paused near the galley, her voice barely audible over the engine's hum. "She's a problem," Whitney muttered to Cal, who stood nervously beside her, fingers twitching on his clipboard. "We need to handle it before she causes a real issue." Cal shifted uncomfortably, his voice low. "I don't know, Whitney. She's already filed a complaint." Whitney laughed. It was sharp, precise. "She won't stop unless we shut her down." Dorothy's pulse ticked faster. She leaned slightly forward, straining to hear more. But Whitney moved deeper into the galley, the words fading into hushed murmurs and rattling trays. Meal service rolled out. The scent of roasted chicken and warm bread filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the Cold War taking place in first class. Whitney emerged again. Her tray was loaded with elegant dishes, her movements graceful and deliberate. She handed a plate to the man in the pinstripes with a syrupy smile, then stopped near Dorothy's seat. Her eyes met Dorothy's. No words, just a long, cold stare. Dorothy returned the look without flinching. Whitney turned away, back through the curtain. Moments later, Cal appeared again. This time his face had gone pale. His hands clutched a slim black wallet. He bent toward the woman in the silk scarf 2 rows ahead, his voice quivering. "Ma'am, is this yours?" The woman gasped, immediately patting her bag. Her eyes widened in shock. "Yes, it was right here. How did it—" She didn't finish. Her gaze swung toward Dorothy, and Dorothy felt the noose tightening. "Right here. How did it get in there?" The woman in the silk scarf stammered, her voice tapering off as her eyes darted toward Dorothy Langston. Suspicion bloomed on her face like a storm cloud. Dorothy's stomach clenched. Cal stepped toward her, clipboard trembling slightly in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough to reach every row, "we discovered this in your bag during a routine check." He held up the black leather wallet. It gleamed beneath the cabin lights, and with it a ripple of gasps and murmurs surged through first class. Dorothy sat up straighter. "That's not mine," she said, her voice firm, her hands still and controlled, even as her heart pounded beneath her blazer. But Whitney Barnes was already stepping forward, her smirk curled at the edges, her voice oozing fake sympathy. "I saw it fall out when she adjusted her purse," she said sweetly. "I'm sorry, but we can't just ignore something like this." The lie was seamless, brazen, and the passengers swallowed it whole. The man in the pinstripe suit stood abruptly, face flushed. "She's a thief," I knew something was off. The woman in the scarf clutched her pearls, nodding furiously. Check her purse again. Who knows what else she has? Dorothy opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but Whitney cut in, voice rising with authority. The captain needs to be informed immediately. She spun on her heel, heels striking the floor like a judge's gavel as she disappeared behind the curtain. Minutes later, the captain's voice filled the cabin again, clipped and cold. We've received a report of theft in first class. For the safety of all passengers, the individual involved will be restrained until landing. Please remain calm. Dorothy's body tensed. Before she could speak, Cal returned, this time flanked by another crew member, a burly man with a buzz cut and blank expression. Both held zip ties. "Ma'am," Cal said, his voice flat, eyes avoiding hers, "we need your cooperation." Her heart pounded, her mind raced, but she didn't resist. She held her breath as they bound her wrists, the plastic biting into her skin, cutting through her dignity. Around her, the cabin broke into twisted celebration. Someone clapped. "Finally!" a voice shouted. The man in pinstripes raised his glass, toasting Whitney. The woman in the scarf nodded with satisfaction. Dorothy sat motionless, the ties tight around her wrists, her purse open in her lap, the wallet nestled like a planted trophy. The lie blazed in front of her, obvious, undeniable, and still no one questioned it. She'd seen setups before, corrupt cops in the 60s planting drugs in glove compartments. But this was personal. A knife, twisted slowly by a smiling hand. "I didn't take anything," she whispered, her voice calm, cutting through the applause like a blade. Whitney leaned in close, her breath hot against Dorothy's cheek. "No one cares what you say," she hissed. "You're finished." Then she stepped back, that awful grin widening, and sauntered away, leaving Dorothy bound, humiliated, and surrounded by cheers. The plane hummed on, the engines steady beneath the chaos. But for Dorothy, the cabin had become a cage, every whisper a bar, every stare a lock clicking into place. Her wrists ached, the ties rubbed raw against her skin, but she kept her face blank, her breathing even. She'd been through worse. She'd faced mobs who spat at her, police who shoved her against walls, and she hadn't broken then. She wouldn't break now. Then, through the fog of humiliation, came a voice, small, clear, defiant. "This isn't right." A girl, no older than 10, stood in the aisle, her braids tied with bright beads, her phone glowing in her hand. Her voice was firm, her eyes wide with innocent truth. "I saw her do it. She put the wallet in that lady's bag during lunch." The cabin gasped. Her mother, a woman in scrubs with a nurse's badge, yanked her back into the seat. "Hush, baby," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. But the damage was done. Heads turned. The whispers changed shape. Whitney spun around, her face drained of color. "No, give me that," she barked, lunging toward the girl. The child stumbled back, startled, but Whitney snatched the phone from her hand. With a furious growl, she slammed it against the armrest. The screen cracked, shattered. "It's broken now," she muttered, her voice shaking with rage. Her eyes darted nervously around the cabin. "No proof, no problem." She tossed the shattered device into the trash bin, her hands trembling. For the first time, her mask slipped. Dorothy sat frozen, wrists still bound, her heart pounding. But inside her, a spark caught flame. The little girl's courage had done something Whitney couldn't control. It planted doubt, not on video, but in the hearts of the people watching. The nurse held her daughter tightly, her eyes locked on Dorothy's. A silent promise passed between them. Someone believed her. Someone had seen the truth, and that was enough to change everything. The cabin buzzed louder now, not with applause, but with tension. A man in a baseball cap leaned to his seatmate. Did she really plant it? That kid sounded sure, the woman replied, her voice shaky. Whitney stood near the galley, posture rigid, fists clenched. She was losing grip. The story she'd built so carefully was cracking. And Dorothy? She wasn't defeated, not even close. She sat tall, the plastic ties a cruel reminder, but also a badge of her endurance. The evidence was broken, but the truth? It had already been spoken, and it was growing. Whitney Barnes had overplayed her hand, and Dorothy Langston knew it. This wasn't the end. It was a shift, a chance to strike back, and she would take it, bound wrists or not. Dorothy sat restrained in her reclaimed first-class seat, the sharp plastic of the zip ties digging into her wrists, cutting grooves that stung with each breath. The plane cruised steadily at 35,000 feet, the hum of engines masking the simmering hostility in the cabin. Passengers whispered. Their glances weren't kind. Their eyes flitted between her and the shattered remnants of the little girl's phone, now a heap of glass and wires in the trash by the galley. Whitney stood smugly near the curtain, her sleek blonde ponytail tight, her uniform spotless. Her smirk slashed across her face, satisfied and venomous. She'd destroyed the proof, silenced the child, and believed she'd buried Dorothy once and for all. The man in pinstripes raised his champagne again, saluting Whitney like a hero. The woman in the scarf nodded tightly, her pearls clutched in approval. But Dorothy kept her gaze forward. Her silver hair glinted under the soft cabin lights. Her breath came steady, even through the pain. She'd been through worse, and she was still here. Across the aisle, the girl with the beaded braids sat quietly, clinging to her mother's arm. Her wide eyes were glassy, but fierce. Her small shoulders trembled with fear and fury. Her mother, Renee, a nurse with a badge clipped to her cardigan, held her close, her face tight with worry. She had seen it. She had watched Whitney slide the wallet into Dorothy's bag, and now her daughter's evidence, her courage, lay smashed. Renee looked at Dorothy, guilt flickering in her expression. Then something shifted, her jaw set. A nurse's instinct took over. She stood. Her voice cut through the cabin like a scalpel. This woman is 75 years old, and you've got her tied up like she's a threat. Passengers turned. Even the hum of idle chatter slowed. She could have circulation problems. A heart episode? You want to explain to the press how you let a medical emergency happen mid-flight? Her tone wasn't angry. It was clinical, sharp, undeniable. Whitney spun around, her smirk cracking. She's a thief, she snapped, loud enough to carry. She's a risk. The captain already gave the order. She's not a risk, Renee interrupted, stepping into the aisle. Her sweater brushed a seat back. I'm a registered nurse. Her wrists are swelling. Her hands are pale. You're one blood clot away from a lawsuit, or worse. The words landed hard. Around them, passengers shifted. Their faces, once smug with judgment, now wore shadows of doubt. And then the cockpit door opened. Out stepped the captain, stocky, gray-haired, brows furrowed. He scanned the tense row, his crisp uniform stiff against the weight of the moment. "What's this about?" he asked, voice gruff. Renee pointed at Dorothy's wrists, raw and red even from a few feet away. "She's elderly. She's restrained for no reason. And it's not safe." The captain hesitated. His eyes lingered on Dorothy, on her stillness, her silence, her zip-tied hands shaking slightly. He'd believed Whitney, issued the order, but the image before him gave him pause. The headlines played out in his mind. Elderly black woman dies in custody mid-flight. He made his call. "Cut her loose," he said. The order was low, but final. Cal stepped forward, still gripping his clipboard like a shield. His hands shook as he fumbled with a utility blade. He sliced through the zip ties with a faint snap. Dorothy gasped softly as her hands fell free. She rubbed her wrists, the marks angry and red against her skin. "Thank you," she said to Renee, her voice composed, eyes full of quiet gratitude. Renee gave a firm nod. Her daughter peeked out from behind her arm, offering Dorothy a tiny smile, shy but triumphant. Dorothy leaned back in her seat. The leather felt cool against her aching palms. Her body was sore, her soul even more so. But for a moment, just a moment, she felt free. The tide had shifted. Renee's bravery, her daughter's courage, they were lifelines. Dorothy's chest softened just slightly. But Whitney wasn't finished. She stood rigid near the galley, arms crossed. Her eyes burned with fury. She'd lost this round, sure. But the war? She wasn't surrendering. Not yet. The captain returned to the cockpit. Cal vanished into the service area, and the plane returned to a tense silence. Passengers sipped drinks. Whispers cooled to murmurs. Dorothy sat quietly, her hands folded over her lap, her mind racing. Renee had cracked the armor. For the first time, Whitney had faltered. Dorothy let herself believe, just for a second, that she might make it through. Her phone buzzed. A text from Malcolm. "I'm here when you land." She smiled faintly. The idea of her son waiting for her sparked something deep, a thread of hope winding through the storm. The captain's voice broke the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are 30 minutes from arrival at Pacific Bay International. Please prepare for descent." Seatbacks clicked into place. Belts snapped. And Dorothy thought, finally, she might breathe. But then Whitney emerged from the galley. Her steps were stiff. Her eyes locked on the cockpit door. She knocked once, slipped inside. Minutes later, the intercom crackled again. The captain's voice had changed, no longer neutral, colder, sharper. "We have received updated information. The passenger in seat 2A is now classified as a security threat due to continued disruptive behavior. Airport police will be waiting at the gate. Please remain seated." Dorothy's heart plummeted. The whisper of freedom she'd just felt. Gone. "We have received updated information." The captain's voice snapped over the intercom, colder than before. "Passenger in seat 2A is now considered a potential security threat due to prior disruptive behavior. Airport security will meet us at the gate. Remain seated." Dorothy Langston's heart dropped. Her hands gripped her leather purse, knuckles white, as the glass of water on her tray trembled with the weight of the moment. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A man in a crisp button-down muttered to his seatmate, knew she was trouble from the start. A woman in a floral silk scarf clutched her armrests as though a storm were inside the plane. Across the aisle, Renee stood up, her voice cutting through the static. "What behavior? She's been sitting here, quietly." But the cockpit door remained shut, and out stepped Whitney Barnes, her face carved in victory. Her smirk gleamed sharper than ever. She'd twisted the truth again, transformed turbulence and false accusations into a declaration of threat. Dorothy's brief moment of peace obliterated. Their eyes met across the aisle. Whitney's sparkled with sick triumph, but Dorothy's stayed calm, unflinching, refusing to give Whitney the victory of fear, because Whitney didn't know who was waiting. The plane descended slowly, the skyline of Ocean View City flickering beneath them like a bed of stars. Dorothy remained still in her seat, her wrists free now, but her spirit shackled under the weight of another injustice. Next to her, Renee's daughter whispered, "Why are they doing this?" Renee hushed her, but her eyes were fiery. The cabin buzzed. The judgment came not in words, but in sideways glances and tightened jaws. Dorothy's phone vibrated again. A message from Malcolm. "I'm here." She clung to it like a lifeline. But Whitney's trap had already snapped shut. At the front of the plane, Whitney stood tall, arms folded, smile curling as the plane touched down. The tires shrieked against the tarmac. The lights of Ocean View International Airport blurred outside the window. A soft jolt, the end of one fight, the beginning of another. "What do you think of this twist? Drop a 1 if Renee's bold stand earned your respect. Drop a 2 if Whitney's latest manipulation made your blood boil. And don't forget to subscribe if you're locked in for justice and ready for Dorothy to turn the tables. Because what's waiting at the gate could be redemption, or could be another ambush." The plane rolled to a stop. Engines whirred low, the weight of anticipation thick in the air. Dorothy sat in seat 2A, hands folded over her purse, wrists bruised and sore. The passengers around her moved slowly, reaching for overhead bags, eyes darting in her direction, heavy with discomfort and judgment. The captain's last message rang in their heads like a warning label. Security threat. Near the galley, Whitney preened, her ponytail bouncing as she adjusted her uniform with smug precision. Dorothy's phone sat in her lap. Malcolm's final text glowed. "I'm here." But the shadow of approaching officers was larger than his words. She smoothed her coffee-stained slacks, lifted her chin, and prepared for the storm. The cabin door opened with a hiss. 2 officers stepped aboard. Their boots struck the floor like drumbeats, one broad and stone-faced, the other lean, with a buzz cut and a badge that read Sergeant Alvarez. "Passenger in 2A," Alvarez barked. "Step forward." Dorothy rose, each movement measured, her purse held tight, her polished loafers gliding quietly down the aisle. Phones rose around her, passengers recording, whispering, eyes wide with judgment or spectacle. Whitney strutted forward, her voice filled with manufactured concern. "That's her," she said loudly, so all could hear. "She's been disruptive since boarding, accusations, theft, refusing instructions." She gestured broadly, as if presenting the final act in her twisted play. The officers didn't hesitate. Their grips were like iron. Dorothy's arms were seized, her body pulled forward, her dignity dragged behind her like a fallen coat. The jet bridge loomed cold and echoing. The officers' boots pounded out her shame. Whitney followed close, grinning like a queen watching her rival escorted from court. They emerged into Gate 14, and the world froze. A crowd had formed, passengers, travelers, staff. Phones rose again, voices whispered. Every step Dorothy took was under a spotlight of scrutiny. The officers forced her forward. One snapped cold steel cuffs around her wrists. The metal dug in deeper than the zip ties ever had. "You're being detained for questioning," Alvarez muttered, almost robotic. Dorothy didn't resist. Her chin stayed high. But inside, her soul screamed. Then a voice, low, sharp, commanding, "Let her go." The crowd parted, and there stood Malcolm Langston, navy suit sharp, shoulders square, eyes blazing. He stormed toward the officers, a security badge in one hand. "Malcolm Langston, CEO of Skyspan Airways. That's my mother, and you're making a catastrophic mistake." Everything stopped. The officers froze, cameras clicked, passengers gasped. Whitney's face paled, her jaw slack. She had underestimated the woman she tried to erase. Malcolm stepped in front of his mother, his hand resting firmly on her shoulder. His voice dropped. "I want those cuffs off. Now." A path cleared like a blade through the crowd as Malcolm Langston, 42, emerged, a storm of quiet authority in a perfectly tailored navy suit. His eyes locked on the image that froze him cold. His mother, Dorothy, handcuffed. His voice erupted across the terminal. "Let her go." It boomed, slicing through the buzz like thunder. His hand flashed his ID, an airline executive badge gleaming under the airport lights. Malcolm Langston, CEO of Skyspan Airways. "That's my mother, and this is a disgrace." The officers hesitated. Sergeant Alvarez's hand hovered over his radio. The taller one stepped back, uncertainty flaring in his eyes. Gasps spread like wildfire. Phones snapped up. "That's him," someone whispered. "Her son, the CEO." A man recording muttered, "She's his mother? Oh, damn." Whitney Barnes, halfway down the jet bridge, stumbled to a halt. Her smirk vanished. Her hands twitched, frozen in place. She hadn't planned for this, hadn't imagined Malcolm would be here. Not now. Not like this. He stepped forward, his tone dropping to a growl. "Release her, or you'll be out of a job by sunrise." Sergeant Alvarez swallowed hard. The taller officer nodded, fumbling for the keys. The cuffs clicked open, falling away with a metallic clatter. Dorothy rubbed her sore wrists, her expression composed, proud. She stepped into her son's arms, and he pulled her close. "You're safe now, Mom," he whispered. "I've got you." But Whitney wasn't done. She shoved through the crowd, her once pristine uniform now rumpled, desperation in her voice. "Wait! She assaulted me mid-flight. I had to protect the passengers." Reporters surged forward, cameras rolled, microphones thrust into faces like drawn swords, passengers pointed phones. Some nodded, some whispered. "She was violent," someone muttered. "That old woman?" another asked. "Really?" Whitney kept speaking, her hands waving, her voice rising. "Ask the other passengers." "She threatened me." Dorothy's heart sank. Even with the cuffs gone, the lie was blooming, twisting through every camera lens, every headline. Beside her, Malcolm's jaw clenched. "That's a lie," he growled. "And I'll prove it." He whipped out his phone, barking into it. "Get legal on the line. I want a lawsuit prepped. Defamation, harassment, abuse of power. And find every recording. Now." But the airport had already lit its torch. Videos of Dorothy being cuffed were spreading like flames. "Violent grandma restrained mid-flight. Airline CEO's mother caught causing chaos in first class." The crowd buzzed louder. Phones glowed brighter. Dorothy's legacy, decades of integrity, shredded in real time. "Look at her," a man muttered. "Had a bad feeling about her from the start." "She attacked a flight attendant," a woman said, replaying Whitney's planted footage. Dorothy stood silent, her hands shaking ever so slightly, her breath measured like it had been in every courtroom, every fight she'd endured. The battle had gone public now, and Whitney's lie had gone viral. Across the concourse, Whitney smoothed her uniform, eyes darting as reporters followed her. Not Dorothy. "There she is," someone said, "the hero flight attendant." Whitney's smirk returned, smaller this time, but there. She'd lost the battle of the cuffs, but she'd won the headlines. Malcolm slid his phone back into his pocket, his voice low and firm. "We're not done." Dorothy exhaled, trying to stay calm as the pain of injustice burned deeper than the metal had. The weight of judgment wasn't just cuffs now. It was millions of eyes. Baggage claim whirred in the background. The overhead lights cast her in cold fluorescence. And the crowd? Still growing, still watching. She stood beside her son, silver hair slightly mussed, purse clutched close, her navy suit stained from coffee, her wrists bruised but unbroken. This wasn't freedom. This was a public crucifixion. Malcolm turned toward his team, already forming in suits at the terminal edge. "Pull every statement, every witness, every frame of footage. I want Barnes suspended tonight." The lawyers nodded, already dialing, already moving. Dorothy stared straight ahead, silent, but not defeated. She'd been mocked, framed, bound, and shamed. But she was still standing, and she'd faced worse, much worse. Whitney didn't know it yet, but the tide was turning. The terminal had thinned. Travelers drifted toward baggage claim, but the glow of phones still lit the space like embers after a fire. The video of Dorothy Langston's so-called assault had gone viral. Her name smeared across the internet like graffiti sprayed over a lifetime of honor. Near Gate 38, Whitney Barnes lingered beneath a glowing sign, her blonde ponytail swaying. Her smirk remained, but unease flickered behind her eyes. She'd turned the terminal into her stage. But Malcolm's arrival had changed the lighting. 38 floors above, at Skyspan Airways headquarters in downtown Los Angeles, Malcolm Langston wasted no time. The next morning, he stormed into his office, his mother beside him. Dorothy's loafers clicked a quiet defiance against the marble floor. She said nothing, but her presence was thunder in silk. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city outside. It shimmered like opportunity, but buzzed with disgrace. Malcolm slammed a folder onto the desk. "Whitney Barnes is suspended, effective immediately. We're reviewing every second of that flight." Dorothy sank into a chair, her purse resting in her lap. Her expression was calm, composed, but her eyes burned with purpose. She'd agreed to testify via video. A laptop glowed before her as she recalled the moment it all began. The snub at boarding, the coffee spill, the planted wallet. "I paid for first class," she said, voice sharp as a gavel. "She forced me out, attacked me, set me up. That's the truth." Malcolm nodded. His team scribbled, lawyers typed. A reckoning felt close. But she was wrong. Whitney didn't crawl away quietly. She had help. Across town, in a dimly lit bar, Greg Baxter, a burly ex-cop turned Union bulldog, tapped his beer bottle against the wood. His buzz cut caught the neon light. He'd worked with Whitney before, shared her quiet contempt for women like Dorothy. Now he saw an opening. He leaked a doctored video to a local news channel. A grainy, manipulated clip showed Dorothy lunging at Whitney mid-flight, her arm outstretched in a frame frozen for effect. It was fake, but convincing enough for screens starved of nuance. Passenger attacks crew, blared headlines. The footage looped nationwide. Dorothy's face frozen mid-lunge, her eyes twisted into something cruel she never felt. A lie, but a viral one. By noon, protesters swarmed the front of Skyspan HQ, dozens strong, signs held high, voices a thunderous chant, "Fire the fraud!" Inside a boardroom high above, Malcolm faced the board. His tie loosened, his fists clenched. The video played on a wall screen, silent and damning. "This is garbage," he barked. "My mother is innocent. We're suing for defamation." But the board shifted in their seats. A man with fogged glasses, Vickers, cleared his throat. "PR is a disaster. Our stock dropped 10%. Another, a woman with a razor-sharp bun, leaned forward. "She's dragging us down. Fire her, or we vote you out." Malcolm's jaw tightened. His voice cracked like thunder. "She's not an employee. She's a passenger. We failed her." He scanned the room. "Try to push me out, and see who falls harder." Silence. But the threat remained, coiled like a viper under the table. Across town, Dorothy sat alone in her hotel suite. A modest room Malcolm had booked near the airport. Her TV flickered with her twisted image, her name now synonymous with chaos. The chants outside echoed through the walls, protesters cheering Whitney's return. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, dignity wrapped around her like armor, even as the world mocked her. She had testified, spoken the truth, and still she'd become the villain. The phone rang. "We're fighting this, Mom," Malcolm said. "Stay strong." "I always do," she replied, her voice steady. But the screen painted her a liar, a fraud, and millions believed it. 2 days later, Whitney Barnes waltzed into her disciplinary hearing, her uniform pressed, her smirk polished. She faced a panel of 3. Her union rep, Greg Baxter, loomed beside her. His thick hand patted her shoulder as she spun her story. "I was protecting passengers. She was unstable. Look at the footage." Her voice was smooth. Her eyes gleamed with victory. The panel barely blinked, their minds made up. "Cleared for duty," the chairwoman said. Her gavel tapped like the end of a heartbeat. Whitney walked out triumphant, heels clicking, legacy intact, Dorothy's name buried, Malcolm's investigation stalled, the board's threats sharpened. Back in the hotel, Dorothy watched it unfold live. Her hands trembled. Outside, the city roared, horns, chants, lights flashing across glass. But she sat still. She had fought back at the gate, had testified, thought Malcolm's power would protect her. But Greg's lie had torn through both their worlds. Her legacy, her son's career, crushed beneath a story too convenient to doubt. Then the door flew open. Malcolm stepped in, tie crooked, shirt wrinkled, fire in his eyes. "They're cowards," he spat. "The board's folding. But I'm not." He knelt beside her, voice fierce. "We'll sue. We'll expose the edit. We'll fight this." Dorothy met his gaze, her voice low, measured. "Then let's finish what they started." The glow of the television flickered across the hotel walls, replaying the doctored footage again and again. Dorothy Langston stood near the window, her coffee-stained navy suit straightened, her silver hair twisted into a crown of quiet defiance. Outside, Los Angeles pulsed like a beast, neon lights flashing above a sea of rage. The chants grew louder. The mob was back. Inside, Malcolm Langston paced like a caged lion, phone buzzing with updates from lawyers and publicists. "They're folding under pressure," he muttered. "But I'm not." Dorothy's gaze didn't leave the skyline, her voice low, resolute. "I know, son, but right now, she's winning." The next morning, she stepped out of Skyspan's disciplinary hearing, the L.A. sun throwing harsh light on old wounds. Her wrists still ached with phantom zip ties. Her reputation, once untouchable, now dragged across cable news screens. Malcolm walked beside her, his suit wrinkled, jaw clenched, one hand steady against the small of her back. The hearing had confirmed the worst. Whitney Barnes reinstated, reputation intact, lie protected. Outside, the crowd swelled. 100 deep now, signs high, voices sharp. "Fire the fraud! No thugs in the sky!" Dorothy barely flinched, but she felt it, the weight of every lie, every whisper, every camera turned against her. The mob surged the moment they spotted her. "There she is!" A man in a trucker hat raised his sign like a weapon. "Get her!" A woman with dyed red hair shoved forward, phone recording, eyes burning with rage. Malcolm stepped between them. "Back off! She's done nothing!" But it didn't matter. Bottles flew. One smashed beside Dorothy's feet, glass scattering across the pavement. She flinched. Malcolm grabbed her, pulling her toward the car. But the crowd pressed in, a wave of slurs and fists. "Thief! Liar! Go back where you came from!" Then a brick flew. Dorothy barely saw it before the pain exploded across her temple. A white-hot slash of fire. She stumbled. Blood trickled down her cheek. Malcolm caught her as she fell. "Mom, stay with me." His voice cracked. Another bottle hit his shoulder. Another shattered against the windshield. He shoved her into the car, slammed the door, dove behind the wheel, and peeled away as fists and signs pounded the hood. Dorothy sagged in the seat, her head throbbing, her vision swimming. Blood soaked her collar. Malcolm's hands gripped the wheel, his voice shaking. "We're okay, Mom. Just hold on. ER's 5 minutes away." She nodded weakly, pressing a napkin to the wound, the pain sharp but manageable. LA's streets blurred outside the window. Horns, screams, red lights. They pulled into the ER. Medics rushed with a stretcher. Dorothy waved them off. She walked inside, dignity in every step, her loafers echoing down the hallway, her purse clutched tight. Doctors worked quickly. 4 stitches sealed the wound. Her vitals were strong. She closed her eyes, just for a moment. When she woke, the room was dim. Machines beeped softly around her. Malcolm sat nearby, his jacket off, sleeves rolled, eyes rimmed with red. "I'm ending this," he whispered, his voice a vow. "Whitney's done." Dorothy sat up, bandages across her forehead, hospital gown in place of her ruined suit. "I'm not finished either," she said. "We fight." She'd survived the mob, the riot, the brick, the slurs. She thought the hospital was a haven. She was wrong. The door burst open. 4 uniformed cops stormed in, boots pounding, badges flashing. The lead officer, a wiry man with a jagged scar on his cheek, stepped forward. "Dorothy Langston," he barked, voice like concrete. "You're under arrest for inciting a riot." Malcolm shot to his feet. "What the hell are you talking about? She's the victim." But they didn't care. Not about the truth. Not about the blood on her collar. Not about the stitches on her head. They only saw the lie Whitney built, and the system eager to protect it. The officer shrugged, cold and indifferent. Cuffs dangled from his belt like a warning. "Witnesses say she started it. We've got orders." Dorothy Langston's heart sank. Her short breath, her healing scalp, her bandaged head, it all meant nothing. Whitney Barnes's unseen hand had moved again. Another ambush. She'd survived the mob, only to be charged as its mastermind. Beside her, Malcolm Langston snapped. 3 of his lawyers barged in behind him, sharp suits and sharper tongues. "This is harassment," one roared, slamming a briefcase on the hospital tray. "She's injured. She was just attacked. You want to arrest her? Show us the evidence." The cops hesitated. Radios crackled. One officer stepped back, then another. The cuffs remained unclipped, for now. Dorothy sat still, bandaged, bruised, but unbroken. The fire in her chest hadn't dimmed. Whitney's revenge had escalated, turned a brick to the head into a rap sheet. Malcolm paced the sterile hospital floor, his phone buzzing every few seconds. "It's Greg," he snapped. "He's pulling the strings behind the scenes." "I know it." Dorothy nodded, her voice even. "He's her muscle. She's not stopping. And she won't. Unless we make her." The nurse changed the channel on the wall-mounted TV. Whitney Barnes appeared, pristine, polished, lying. "That woman's a thug," she said smoothly. "She endangered an entire flight. I was just doing my job." The anchor nodded solemnly. The headline below screamed, "Flight attendant hero speaks out after passenger riot." Dorothy's stomach turned. Her name, once honored, was now viral poison. Her hospital room felt like a prison. Malcolm hit mute, his voice a low promise. "She's lying through her teeth. We'll prove it." But outside the glass, 2 officers lingered, their silhouettes still, watching, waiting. The trap was still tightening. Dorothy propped herself against pillows, her bandage pulled tight across her scalp. She'd survived the mob, the hospital, the riot. She had thought the stitches marked the end of Whitney's grip, but Greg Baxter's next move had flipped the entire script, made her the villain, again. Malcolm stood beside her, tie loosened, rage simmering just beneath his breath, but the TV still looped Whitney's venom. Dorothy's voice cut through the silence. They want a villain? Fine. We'll give them a villain they can't contain. She reached for the hospital phone, her lawyer's instincts firing again, dialed the number of a local news station, her voice calm. I'm Dorothy Langston. I'd like to make a statement. The anchor on the other end nearly leapt. A live feed was scheduled for that same evening. The city buzzed. By dusk, the hospital room was wired. Cameras, mics, a grainy feed broadcast across Los Angeles. Dorothy's bandaged head filled the screen, her presence undeniable. Malcolm sat beside her, silent, steady, her anchor. The news anchor's voice crackled through. Joining us live, Dorothy Langston, the woman at the center of the Airline riot. Go ahead, ma'am. Dorothy leaned forward, her voice measured, calm, calculated. I'm sorry for the chaos outside that hearing, she said. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted the seat I paid for. Nothing more. She paused, let the words sink in. And if stepping aside now helps clear the smoke, so be it. But let's not forget how this began. Her tone sharpened. With a lie, a smirk. A woman in uniform who thought she could erase me. Her words cut through the static like a razor. Across the city, millions watched. Let this settle, Dorothy Langston said into the mic. Her voice was calm, regret-laced. For everyone's sake. Her hands trembled, just enough. Her gaze lowered, a masterstroke of restraint. Beside her, Malcolm Langston's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. He understood. This was part of the plan. So you're admitting fault? The anchor pressed. Dorothy paused. Let the silence breathe. I take responsibility for the tension, she said softly. That's all I'll say. Across town, in a cluttered apartment, Whitney Barnes sprawled across her couch, a beer in hand. Her ponytail was loose, her lips curled into a smug grin. She watched Dorothy's broadcast with glee. A surrender, a white flag, a win. Told you she'd break, she snickered, grabbing her phone. On the other end, Greg Baxter's gruff voice crackled. She's done. You're golden. Whitney laughed, sharp and triumphant. They thought it was over. They were wrong. While Dorothy played her hand, Malcolm was busy. His team combed through old records, flight logs, HR reports, complaint archives. They struck gold. Whitney had been fired from 2 other airlines, one in Dallas, one in Chicago, both for racist outbursts. Passenger abuse, racial slurs, denial of service, buried complaints. Malcolm leaked the files to a rival news station. As Dorothy's public retreat aired, the exposé broke. Flight attendants' racist past unearthed. On screen, victims spoke up. She called me trash, said I wasn't first-class material. Black male passenger refused me a blanket, told me I didn't rate. Latina woman. Whitney's smirk vanished. Her phone exploded with calls. Union reps panicked. Greg cursed in her ear. Skyspan HQ folded under pressure. Her reinstatement was revoked. Not fired, but demoted. A basement desk job. No passengers, no uniform, no power. In her apartment, Whitney hurled her beer bottle at the wall. Glass shattered. She'd dropped her guard. Thought she'd crushed Dorothy. But Malcolm's timed counterstrike gutted her. At the hospital, Dorothy sat upright in bed. TV off. Smile faint. Malcolm handed her the news coverage on his phone. "Good work, son," she said, her voice like iron wrapped in silk. She'd baited Whitney, made her arrogant, then let her fall. They thought it was the knockout punch. They were wrong again. Greg Baxter wasn't done. Angry, cornered, ex-cop rage boiling under his skin, he called in old favors, built a vigilante crew of burned-out toughs and badge-waving bar-room brutes. They found Dorothy's house, a modest Crenshaw bungalow, flower pots on the porch, a quiet sanctuary. That night, after her discharge, Dorothy returned home, stitches still healing, spirit still unbroken. Malcolm dropped her off at the curb. "Rest, Mom. I'll be back tomorrow." She nodded, unlocked the door, and stepped into silence. Lavender in the air, her haven. She thought peace had come. Then came the engines. Headlights flared outside. Boots stomped across her lawn. A shadow army descended. The first Molotov cocktail exploded through her front window. Glass shattered. Curtains ignited. Flames roared. Smoke rose fast and thick. Dorothy gasped, scrambling from her bed, grabbing her purse. A second bottle hit the porch. Potted plants ignited like kindling. "Burn her out!" someone screamed. "Finish her!" another voice bellowed. She stumbled to the back door, lungs seizing. Fire surrounded her. Her past, everything, melting into ash. She kicked open the door and fled barefoot into the night, her pajamas clinging to her smoke-drenched skin. Behind a neighbor's shed, she collapsed, coughing, trembling, purse still clutched like a lifeline. The bungalow, her home, devoured by flame. The mob cheered as the sky turned red. Greg's voice rose above the chaos. "She's done now." Whitney wasn't there, but her fingerprints were all over it. Dorothy's sanctuary turned into a bonfire of vengeance. She thought she'd finished the game. Instead, the board had flipped again. Malcolm's car screeched into view. His headlights slashed through the smoke. He bolted from the driver's seat, shouting her name. Sirens finally wailed in the distance. Too late. Dorothy blinked through the haze as he found her, cradled her. The blaze behind them lit the night like a war zone. The war wasn't over. It had just been set on fire. The night swallowed the flames, but the sirens were still far off. Malcolm Langston's car screeched into the alley, headlights slicing through the smoke and chaos. "Mom, get in!" he shouted, ash streaking his navy suit, his voice hoarse with panic. Dorothy Langston stumbled forward, her loafers slipping on wet grass, her purse clutched tight against her side. Malcolm pulled her into the car, slammed the door, and floored the gas. Behind them, Greg Baxter's mob cheered. The fire devoured her home. The air cracked with victory. And Dorothy's fake surrender was now ashes in the wind. They weaved through LA's backstreets, neon signs blurring past. "We're going underground," Malcolm said, breath ragged. "Safe house. They won't find us." Dorothy nodded, her head throbbing beneath the stitches, her voice steady. "Good. Then we hit back. Harder." Malcolm glanced at her, her resolve unshaken. Her plan was already rising from the ashes. The safe house was a stripped-down condo tucked in a quiet corner of Echo Park. No pictures, no warmth, just concrete and silence. They slipped inside, locked the door. Dorothy sank onto the couch, her pajamas stiff with soot, while Malcolm opened his laptop, fingers flying across the keys. "We broadcast," she said, eyes fierce. "We burn the lies down." The stream went live at midnight. Dorothy's bandaged head and Malcolm's grim face filled the shaky feed. "This is Dorothy Langston," she began. "My home was burned tonight because of Whitney Barnes's lies. She framed me, she targeted me, and now her allies have torched my life." Malcolm clicked open files, termination letters, passenger complaints, Audio of Whitney's racial slurs. Dallas. Chicago, Dorothy said. She's no hero. She's a coward, Malcolm growled, hiding behind a uniform. The stream caught fire online, shares erupting, support building. The city awoke to the truth. Flight witnesses chimed in. Tanya, the nurse, appeared on a local newscast. She planted that wallet, she said. This woman didn't deserve any of it. The young woman with braids posted her own clip. She smashed my phone. I saw it all. Others joined. A man in a cap, a mother with a toddler. Testimonies poured in, one after another, and the narrative flipped. Justice for Dorothy trended. Protests moved from Dorothy's name to Whitney's front door. Skyspan headquarters filled with chants, "Fire the fraud." And finally, Whitney cracked. Her demotion revoked. Her desk job pulled. A termination notice delivered. Malcolm's phone buzzed with the update. "She's out," he said. "For good." Dorothy stood in borrowed clothes, her loafers by the door. She exhaled, a flicker of peace. At dawn, she stepped onto the balcony. The air was cool, the stitches tugged on her scalp, but the city looked quieter. We did it, she thought, her name restored, her truth told. But then her phone rang. An unknown number flashed across the screen. She answered. A gravelly laugh oozed through. "Think this is over?" Greg Baxter sneered. "Check the news." Dorothy's stomach turned. Malcolm spun the TV toward her. A grainy live feed filled the screen, shot inside a dim warehouse. Malcolm's face was bloodied, his navy suit torn, a gun pressed to his temple. Greg stood behind him, grinning like a devil. "Dorothy Langston," he barked, "you've got 1 hour. Go on air. Take it all back, or your boy's gone." To his side, Whitney Barnes paced like a caged animal, her hair wild, her eyes manic. No uniform, just vengeance. "You thought you won?" she shrieked. "You've got nothing." Dorothy froze. Her breath caught. Her knees buckled, but she didn't fall. On screen, Malcolm's wrists were bound. His eyes, despite the bruises, were defiant. A gag muffled his voice. Greg's crew, 6 shadowy men, stood behind them, holding bats, knives, smirking. "Tick-tock," Greg said. 1 hour. The feed cut. The anchor on the news stumbled for words. Dorothy's purse hit the floor. Her mind spiraled. She'd burned Whitney's reputation, tore through her lies. But this was Malcolm's life, her son, her anchor. And now his blood was the next lie's price. She stared into the glow of the laptop and knew. The next move was hers. The live feed burned on screen, a split image of Dorothy Langston, composed but bleeding, and her son Malcolm, bound in a shadowy warehouse with a gun at his head. Dorothy had outwitted Whitney Barnes, shattered her career, and turned the public tide. But now Greg Baxter had turned her victory into a trap. Her son was the price. She stood in the Echo Park safehouse, the sunrise bleeding through slatted blinds. Her sweater was loose over soot-stained pajamas, her silver hair still wild from the fire, her voice calm despite the noose tightening around her son's neck. "Find that warehouse, now," she barked into the phone. Malcolm's team scrambled, triangulating signal data, racing against Greg's hour deadline. But time slipped like sand. Dorothy had played every card, rallied witnesses, exposed Whitney's past, reclaimed her name. But now her fight wasn't just justice, it was survival. She stared at the blank screen, picturing her son's bruised face, his promise to protect her, his vow to finish this war. And now he was the one who needed saving. 40 minutes left. Dorothy called Tanya, the nurse from the flight. "They've got him. Warehouse. Live feed. Tip the FBI, please? Tanya didn't hesitate. I'm on it, she said. Dorothy hung up and called the local news station next. Put me on. I'll retract everything. Just patch me into that warehouse feed. Her voice was firm, but her hands trembled behind her back. The split screen went live again. Dorothy on one side, bandaged and bruised. Malcolm on the other, bound, gagged, blood trickling down his temple. Greg loomed behind him, gun in hand, voice like gravel. "Start talking," he growled. Whitney paced like a rabid dog, her blonde hair tangled, eyes glittering. Dorothy leaned into the mic. "I'm Dorothy Langston. I accused Whitney Barnes. I said she framed me, burned my home." She swallowed hard. "I was wrong." Her voice slowed, stretching each syllable like molasses. "The flight, the riot. It was my fault. Every word was bait, buying seconds." Greg's sneer softened. His grip on the gun eased, but Whitney exploded. "Louder! Say it like you mean it!" she shrieked, eyes wild. Dorothy repeated herself, tone trembling. "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Her words were dipped in desperation, yet tinged with steel. She was stalling, stretching, praying. Just a few more minutes, she thought. Behind Malcolm, Greg's men shifted, uneasy. One cracked his knuckles, another gripped a bat. The atmosphere was a powder keg. 20 minutes left, Dorothy continued. "I take it back. I shouldn't have fought her. It was my mistake." Greg nodded slowly, but Whitney wasn't satisfied. She snapped, "Enough!" She lunged for Greg's belt and yanked his pistol free, hands shaking. "Say it's over, or I shoot him now." She raised the weapon, her face twisted with rage. The warehouse echoed with tension. On the safe-house screen, Dorothy's eyes widened. She broke character, her voice rising. "It's over. Please don't. I'm done." 15 minutes left. Greg tried to calm Whitney, his voice low. "She's doing it. Chill." But Whitney was beyond control. Her eyes blazed, her finger twitched, and then she fired. Dorothy screamed. The bullet had grazed her left arm, a hot, searing cut tearing through her sweater. She collapsed to one knee, clutching the wound, blood blooming beneath her fingers. The safe house shook from the sound, but she didn't fall. She stayed up, body swaying, but spine steel. On screen, Malcolm roared into his gag. His chair rocked. Then he lunged. His bound fists crashed into Greg's legs. Greg stumbled, the gun slipping from his hand. Malcolm slammed his shoulder into him, knocking them both sideways as the chair tipped. The feed pixelated, camera jerking. Dorothy gasped, her hand still bleeding, her eyes locked on the screen. "Come on, baby," she whispered. The war had shifted again. Dorothy Langston slumped on the safe-house couch, her bandaged head resting against a throw pillow, her borrowed sweater soaked with blood from the grazing shot. Her silver hair clung to her damp forehead, her loafers still smoky from the house fire. The Los Angeles dawn bled through cracked blinds, casting golden bars of light across the walls. The laptop still buzzed faintly with static, the last trace of the FBI raid that saved her son. "I'm okay, Mom. They're done," Malcolm's voice had crackled through her phone just minutes ago. It should have felt like victory. Greg Baxter cuffed. Whitney Barnes screaming as agents dragged her out. Her son alive. But Dorothy knew better. This wasn't just about surviving. This was about ending it. The room spun softly around her. The sting of the bullet grazed her arm. Every breath came with a pulse of pain, but her mind was sharp, razor sharp. She'd faced fire, bricks, cuffs, and mobs. She'd exposed Whitney, faked surrender, baited Greg. and tipped the FBI through Tanya's call. She had survived, but now she had to destroy. The front door swung open. Malcolm burst in, his navy suit in tatters, blood crusted on one temple, one sleeve torn from the warehouse scuffle. "Mom!" he gasped, dropping beside her. "You're bleeding. We need help." She gripped his arm with surprising strength, her eyes locked onto his. "I'm fine, but we're not done." He froze, confused. Then she reached into her scorched leather purse, pulled out something small, dark, and scratched. A voice recorder. Old school, compact, the kind she carried as a lawyer. Malcolm's eyes widened. "You recorded?" She nodded, eyes blazing. Every word. From the flight to the fire, from Whitney's venom to Greg's cop ties. "I taped it all." She pressed play. Whitney's voice crackled first. "She doesn't belong here. Never will." Then another. Lisa mocking Evelyn after the coffee spill. Lisa smirking about overbooking. Lisa whispering to the captain before the Turbulence announcement. The tone changed. Greg's growl. "The cops owe me. She's ours. She framed my girl, now she burns." Then Whitney again, raving in the warehouse. "Say it, or I shoot." Every whisper, every lie, every setup. Malcolm stared at the recorder like it was a bomb ticking in his palm. "Mom!" "This is everything." Dorothy's voice was steel. "We finish them, not with fists, with truth." Malcolm stood, fire in his eyes, already dialing his legal team. "We'll drop it tonight. National media. No edits. Uncut." The tides had turned before, but now this was the flood. Dorothy exhaled slowly, the ache in her arm pulsing, but her spirit unshaken. She'd saved her son, brought the truth to light. Now she'd burn their legacy. Whitney and Greg had underestimated the old woman in seat 2A. They thought they'd buried her, thought they'd humiliated her, shamed her into silence. But this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of the reckoning. Dorothy Langston's eyes glinted with fire as the recording played. Nathan's jaw tightened, his mind racing. Every sneer, every threat, Whitney's venom and Greg's corruption spilled from the speaker like fuel on a flame. "This changes everything," Nathan murmured, his voice a promise. "Take it to the board," Dorothy said. "Finish them." By noon, Skyspan's boardroom was a pressure cooker. Gray-suited directors sat frozen as the tape rolled. Whitney's voice hissed, "She doesn't belong here. Never will." Greg's growl followed. "Cops owe me. She's ours." Vickers, the executive who once called for Dorothy's removal, sank into his seat. "The woman with the tight bun?" She slid her resignation letter across the table and stormed out. Within hours, 6 board members quit in disgrace. Their complicity couldn't be explained away. At an emergency meeting, Nathan's voice rang out. "My mother is now interim CEO, effective immediately." Dorothy Langston walked into the executive office, not as a victim, but as leader. Her arm bandaged, her loafers tapping polished marble, her silver hair shining like a crown. She sat at the desk, once denied to her, and took command. The city below buzzed. Skyspan stock dipped, then steadied under Nathan's firm hand. Headlines lit up. "Survivor becomes CEO after exposing airline racism." Nathan stood behind her. "You flipped it, Mom. They're gone. You're here." She smiled, quiet and sharp. "Not about me, son. It's about fixing this." She'd turned a setup into a seat of power. Whitney's trap became her ladder. From her jail cell, Whitney Barnes screamed, her blonde hair tangled, her orange jumpsuit wrinkled. The TV mounted on the wall flickered with Dorothy's inauguration. "No one's dignity will be stolen again," Dorothy's voice echoed. Whitney clawed at the bars, her voice breaking. That was supposed to be my job. But her world had flipped. She'd torched a woman's life, only to watch that woman rise from the ashes to rule the empire she tried to destroy. Greg Baxter, in a neighboring cell, slumped, his cop ties severed, his crew dismantled, his power turned to dust. Dorothy stood at the podium, her speech broadcast nationwide. I faced slights, fire, mobs, a bullet. But I'm here to dismantle the system that let it happen, because no one's seat, no one's worth should ever be questioned again. Tears welled in Tanya's eyes, watching from home. The little girl with braids beamed. So did the passengers who had once whispered, but now stood proud. Nathan stood behind her, his bruises healed, his suit pressed. "You did it, Mom. They never stood a chance." She looked at him, eyes steady. "We did it. Together." The skyline glowed red with sunset. Skyspan's logo lit up behind her, but this time it stood for something real. Dorothy sat back at the desk, her loafers crossed, her purse beside her, a relic of the journey. She sipped tea, her hands no longer trembling. She'd survived the flight, the mob, the fire, the gun, the lie. Each one felt like the end, but each had only been a step to this desk, this power, this unexpected rise.